Just 1 minute ago, political shockwaves ripped across Westminster as Richard Tice unleashed a move no one saw coming. A move that instantly sent Keir Starmer into full-blown panic. In a stunning escalation, Tice publicly demanded that migrant placements be shifted directly onto Labour-run and Liberal Democrat-run councils, forcing them to carry the consequences of their own policies. What followed wasn't strategy, it was meltdown. A chaotic confrontation, frantic reactions, and a government suddenly exposed under the brightest spotlight of its term. And this is where everything begins. The storm didn't start quietly, it erupted. Reports began flooding in that Richard Tice had just challenged the government in one of the most aggressive political manoeuvres of the year, calling out Labour and the Liberal Democrats in a way that instantly set the nation talking. His message was sharp, direct, and impossible for Downing Street to ignore. If Labour and the Lib Dems want open borders, then their councils should take the migrants first. Within minutes, a political firestorm lit up the country. Starmer's reaction was immediate and it wasn't calm. Sources inside Number 10 described the scene as a mess of raised voices, tense briefings, and frantic scrambling as teams tried to contain the situation before it spiralled beyond control. For months, the government had struggled to manage the growing backlash over migrant distribution policies. But Tice's move struck at the weakest point. Accountability. He wasn't just criticising, he was flipping the entire argument onto Labour's doorstep, and that is what triggered the meltdown. Starmer's team feared the optics, a Labour-led government being forced to defend why their own councils weren't taking the very migrants they insisted every community should accept. Political commentators described the reaction as the most rattled Starmer has looked since taking office, with ministers rushing into emergency calls and Labour councillors suddenly being bombarded with questions they had desperately hoped to avoid. The panic grew louder as Tice doubled down. In a fiery public statement, he demanded transparency, asking why areas under Labour and Lib Dem control had some of the lowest placement rates in the country. The accusation wasn't just bold, it was devastating. It painted a picture of hypocrisy, one that spread across social media, talk shows and news feeds with lightning speed. Inside Downing Street, advisors warned the Prime Minister that silence would only make things worse, but speaking could fuel the fire even more. The tension became visible and Starmer's attempts to stay composed began to crack around the edges. Across the country, people watched in disbelief as the confrontation became the top story. A dramatic showdown that exposed the shaky ground beneath the government's messaging. Opposition leaders smelled blood, Labour supporters demanded explanations, and councils quietly braced for the impact of what Tice had started. It wasn't just a political stunt anymore, it had turned into a national debate that Starmer could no longer control. Every hour that passed pushed him deeper into a corner, and the meltdown only intensified as the pressure mounted. More voices joined the chaos, mayors, councillors, activists, and even members of Starmer's own party. Each forced into a difficult position. Tice had drawn a red line, and now the spotlight was fixed firmly on Labour and the Lib Dems. The government's attempt to regain control only made the cracks more visible. And as the story built momentum, one thing became clear: this wasn't blowing over. It was only the beginning of a political earthquake that would shake the foundations of the government for days to come. The situation detonated even further when the numbers began circulating. Figures showing that many Labour and Lib Dem councils had some of the lowest migrant intake rates in the entire country. What was once political speculation was now hard data, and it struck the heart of Starmer's government like a direct hit. Suddenly, every political commentator, every news panel, every online platform was asking the same burning question. If Labour is so confident in its migration policies, why aren't their own councils leading by example? The country watched as the pressure tightened around Starmer, squeezing him into a spotlight he could not escape. Downing Street officials scrambled to rewrite statements, prepare responses and shift the narrative, but the damage was already spreading faster than they could catch it. Meetings ran back to back. Phones rang non-stop. Advisors whispered hurriedly behind closed doors. It was clear the Prime Minister's team had not expected this kind of ambush, and now they were being forced into defensive mode. Political insiders described the atmosphere as electric with panic, with staff racing to stop the story before it exploded beyond repair. But outside those gates, Richard Tice wasn't slowing down. He was accelerating. He went live again, firing another shot directly at the government, exposing inconsistencies that Labour had kept buried beneath polished speeches and vague promises. Tice's demand wasn't just political pressure, it was a calculated trap. By insisting that Labour-run areas take migrants first, he put Starmer in an impossible position. If the government complied, it admitted hypocrisy. If it resisted, it admitted fear. Either way, Starmer looked like a man caught in his own message, struggling to defend policies that weren't holding up under scrutiny. And that was exactly what began to show. Starmer's usually careful, controlled public tone started slipping. His interviews felt shaky. His answers grew shorter, sharper, more defensive. Viewers noticed. Journalists noticed. Even members of his own party noticed. Within Labour, quiet frustration started turning into open concern. MPs privately questioned why the Prime Minister had walked straight into Tice's line of fire without a stronger strategy. Council leaders panicked as reporters camped outside their offices, pressing them to explain why their wards weren't taking on the responsibility the government insisted was shared. In local communities, anger began to swirl. Some residents accused Labour councils of pushing responsibilities onto Conservative areas while protecting their own political comfort zones. Others felt lied to, misled, or simply tired of what they called selective fairness. The messaging that once felt firm now seemed full of holes. Starmer's cabinet ministers attempted to deflect the avalanche, but each appearance only fueled more frustration. Instead of stopping the storm, they were feeding it. Meanwhile, Richard Tice capitalised on every moment. His statements were simple, sharp, and impossible to misinterpret. He insisted he wasn't playing politics, but he was exposing it, and millions of people across every political line were now paying attention. His narrative dominated the conversation. He wasn't just criticising Labour, he was reshaping the entire public debate, pulling the government into a battle it wasn't ready to fight. Behind the scenes, sources claimed Starmer held a series of emergency calls with senior Labour councillors, urging them to stay calm, hold the line, and avoid making public statements that might worsen the situation. But by then, it was too late. The workers on the ground had already begun to feel the heat. Journalists knocked on doors. Constituents demanded answers. Social media erupted, calling it the biggest migration embarrassment of Starmer's term. And as the noise grew louder, something even more dangerous began emerging. Doubt. Doubt inside the party, doubt among voters, doubt inside the government itself. A sense that maybe, just maybe, Labour didn't have the control they claimed. And in politics, doubt spreads faster than truth and hits harder than any speech or a headline. The meltdown inside government reached a breaking point when footage began circulating online showing Starmer in what appeared to be a tense, heated exchange with senior advisors. Though the clip was only a few seconds long, it spread like wildfire, becoming the symbol of a Prime Minister losing control of the narrative. Commentators described it as the moment the mask slipped, suggesting that the pressure from Richard Tice's challenge had hit far deeper than the government wanted the public to believe. Within minutes, the clip dominated social media, fueling the perception that Starmer was rattled, cornered, and unsure of his next move. As the digital storm intensified, local leaders in Labour and Lib Dem councils were thrust into a sudden spotlight they had desperately hoped to avoid. Questions poured in. Why were migrant placements so low in areas that claimed to champion inclusivity? Why were neighbouring Conservative regions carrying a far heavier load? Why had no one addressed this imbalance before? These weren't whispers anymore. They were national questions, amplified by Richard Tice's bold attacks and repeated by millions who felt they had been misled for too long. Inside Labour headquarters, frustration turned into fracture. Some councillors pushed back, arguing they weren't given enough resources. Others blamed Starmer's team for failing to coordinate a consistent message. A few, behind closed doors, openly admitted that Tice had exposed a weakness they all knew existed, but had never expected to be weaponised so quickly. The disunity seeped through every layer of the party, widening cracks that Starmer could no longer patch with talking points or soft focus interviews. Meanwhile, Tice used the chaos to fire off his most devastating argument yet. If Labour truly believed in fairness, why were they asking the rest of Britain to carry a burden they refused to shoulder themselves? That one line hit harder than any speech or statistic. It became a rallying cry for his supporters and a haunting echo for Starmer's government. Across the country, people repeated it in pubs, living rooms, radio shows and online forums. Suddenly, migration wasn't just a policy debate. It was a question of credibility. Starmer's inner circle pushed for a televised statement to calm the nation, but every draft sounded weak, defensive or worse. Desperate. Advisors feared that anything Starmer said would be twisted, replayed, and used against him. And so the government hesitated, allowing the narrative to slip even further out of its control. While they stalled, Tice advanced. He hosted press briefings, visited council areas, and highlighted disparities with the sharpness of someone who knew the public mood had turned in his favour. As the story grew, political analysts began predicting a collapse of confidence in Starmer's leadership if he failed to regain control quickly. Pollsters noticed shifts happening in real time, a dangerous sign for any government. Even in areas traditionally loyal to Labour, voters began questioning the sincerity of the party's promises. The idea that Labour preached one thing and practised another spread like a stain, impossible to scrub away. And just as Labour attempted to stabilise the situation, another blow hit. Documents leaked anonymously showing internal disagreements over migrant placement plans going back months. Arguments, warnings, complaints, all buried beneath official statements that painted a far calmer picture than the reality behind the scenes. The leak didn't just expose disorganisation, it exposed fear. It showed a government struggling long before Tice struck. The combination of leaks, viral footage, public anger and Tice's relentless pressure created a perfect storm, swallowing the government's messaging whole. What began as a political confrontation had now evolved into a full-scale credibility crisis, and as daylight faded, one truth became impossible to deny. The longer Starmer stayed silent, the louder his critics grew. And the stronger Richard Tice's momentum became. By the time morning headlines hit the front pages, the crisis had grown into something far bigger than a political dispute. It had become a national reckoning. Starmer woke to a barrage of commentary calling the government's silence a confession in disguise. Every newspaper, every broadcaster, every online outlet led with the same explosive story. Richard Tice had flipped the migration debate upside down, and Labour had no clear answer. What was supposed to be a routine policy discussion had morphed into a full-scale confrontation, threatening to redefine the balance of power across Westminster. Pressure inside Downing Street reached a boiling point. Ministers who had remained loyal through previous controversies now began voicing concerns more openly. Some warned that if Starmer didn't take decisive action within hours, the narrative would cement itself permanently, that Labour preached responsibility but avoided it themselves. Others urged him to attack Tice directly, to reclaim the conversation before it spiralled fully out of reach. Yet every option came with risks. And Starmer knew the wrong move could ignite an even more damaging backlash. Meanwhile, Richard Tice seized the moment with surgical precision. He went live once again, declaring that Labour and Lib Dem councils had shielded themselves while burdening everyone else. His words were sharp, emotional and accessible, the exact tone that resonated with communities who felt ignored for years. His message spread far beyond his usual supporters. Even those who disagreed with him politically admitted he had struck a nerve. Tice didn't just expose an imbalance, but he framed it as a moral failing. And Starmer, trapped in a defensive crouch, struggled to push back. In regional towns and major cities alike, local frustration intensified. Community groups demanded investigations. Councillors held emergency meetings. Constituents flooded inboxes with demands for transparency, accountability and real answers. Every hour brought a new wave of anger sweeping through Labour's network. Some councillors pushed statements out quickly, trying to defend their areas. Others stayed silent, afraid that anything they said would be torn apart by the public. The disorganisation only added fuel to the crisis. As tensions rose, an unexpected ripple began shaking the Libdem leadership as well. Though they were smaller in scale, their councils were facing the same accusations: low intake rates, inconsistent policies and contradictory messaging. Lib Dem leaders initially tried to distance themselves from the chaos, blaming Labour for the situation. But as documents and statistics continued to circulate online, it became clear that both parties were in the firing line. Tice had purposely targeted them together, ensuring neither could escape the fallout. Inside Whitehall, senior civil servants warned that if the government didn't produce a coherent plan soon, public confidence could collapse entirely. Leaked memos revealed frantic discussions about shifting migrant placements, adjusting budgets, and even redrawing allocation strategies, all to counter the growing narrative that Labour's system was fundamentally unfair. But each proposal seemed rushed, untested, and scattered. Starmer's team weren't strategising anymore. They were reacting, struggling to plug holes in a dam already cracking apart. By midday, journalists surrounded Downing Street, waiting for any sign of movement. Speculation grew that Starmer might deliver a rare emergency statement. Some believed he would confront Tice head-on. Others feared he would try to deflect the issue, risking even more public anger. Rumours swirled, tension thickened, and the atmosphere felt electric, as if the entire country was holding its breath, waiting to see whether the Prime Minister would steady the ship or sink further into crisis. And then, just as pressure reached its peak, a bombshell landed. A senior Labour source leaked that several councils had privately asked the government months earlier to reduce migrant placements in their areas, contradicting public claims of full support for the policy. This revelation hit like a sledgehammer. It didn't just challenge Labour's message, it shattered it. Suddenly, everything Richard Tice had accused them of looked not only plausible, but alarmingly true. The moment the leak hit the airwaves, one thing became undeniable: Starmer was out of time. The meltdown wasn't just continuing, but it was accelerating toward a point of no return, a place where the government's credibility hung by the thinnest possible thread. And all of Britain was waiting to see if that thread would snap.